In here, and we're back. We're talking a little bit about COVID and the intersection between COVID, long COVID, and EEOC and Americans with Disabilities Act accommodations. Before we get started, I really would appreciate it if you would click the subscribe button. You can see it down there below. Also, click the bell if you want to get notices of when we put new content up. So, a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the U.S. Department of Justice, along with some other agencies, got together and started to issue some regulation and guidance about long COVID. Now, most of us are familiar with COVID. Obviously, the difficulty breathing, fevers, things of that nature. Most people recover and recover fully. It may take them a while, but they usually get back to where they were once their body is finished fighting off the COVID virus. There are some people who get what has now become known as long COVID. Now, some of the most common symptoms of long COVID are tiredness or fatigue, difficulty concentrating or thinking, colloquially known as brain fog, shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, headache, dizziness, heart palpitations, cough, joint muscle pain, depression or anxiety, or exacerbated depression or anxiety, fever, a loss of taste or smell. This isn't a big old long exhaustive list, but these are some of the most common things. Now, some people on the more extreme sides of long COVID may experience damage to multiple organs, including lungs. Oftentimes when you have damage to lungs, you have damage to the heart, the kidney, and sometimes some damage to the brain. A lot of this is still being studied for some fairly obvious reasons, so we're not quite sure all of the general symptoms of long COVID, but these are the ones that seem to be reported a lot. So the HHS, the Department of Justice, and a few other organizations, including the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that's the agency that's responsible for overseeing and enforcing the Americans with Disabilities Act. They are now considering that it's a possibility that long COVID can be a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act and a few other sorts of laws if it limits one or more of the major life activities. Well, gee, Matt, what the hell does life activity mean? Well, it includes a wide range of things, but one of the things that's most important when we're dealing with long COVID is performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, breathing, lifting, reading, concentrating, thinking, writing, communication, all of the things that you do in a day-to-day life on average. If that major life activity is substantially limited, okay, it doesn't mean completely incapable of being able to do it, but it's otherwise substantially limited, then that's a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And you are going to have to engage in an interactive dialogue with your employee if they are making a request for a disability. Now, I've talked about in the past, sometimes that request for disability doesn't always look like, hey, I need a request for an accommodation for my disability. It may be, I'm having a really hard time concentrating at work. I need to have frequent breaks. I'm looking for a place to sit that's quiet, where I can sort of maybe take a short nap, maybe just recuperate, rest a little bit. These accommodation requests aren't always going to be accompanied by the words accommodation request. That's my point. But if you receive one, or you receive communications from employees that says, wow, I've got this long COVID, or I think I've got this long COVID, and it's really affecting the way that I work, then it is time to have that interactive dialogue that you are required to have as an employer when dealing with an Americans with Disabilities request. So even if this impairment is not permanent, even if the impairment is just sort of an every once in a while thing, you can come up with an accommodation that will allow you as the employer and the employee to accommodate this issue of long COVID. Now, right now it's unsure how long COVID is going to be around with us long term, but it is something that employers should be cognizant of. And because the EEOC and HHS and the Department of Justice are looking at this as a potential disability, it is something that you need to be prepared to deal with. Now, long COVID is not always a disability. Most people with, obvious disabilities such as blindness or the loss of a limb or, confinement to a wheelchair, these are pretty much permanent. But long COVID may not be permanent, but just because it's not permanent doesn't mean it's not a disability. And just because a person has long COVID doesn't mean they have a disability. So that's where things are going to get a little freaky, a little difficult. So what are some of the things that you may be required to do? You may be looking at longer or more frequent break times for people with long COVID. You may be looking at periods of time where they're working from home. You may be looking at more accommodation in terms of perhaps chairs, better chairs, different chairs. You may be looking to put them in an area of the workspace that is quieter or provide them a place that is quiet so that they can recoup and recover. Okay. So what can you do? You can ask, I do want to remind employers, if somebody's asking for an accommodation due to long COVID, you can ask for medical documents that substantiate the claim. It's perfectly reasonable, it's perfectly normal. You can ask for guidance or recommendations from medical professionals on how do we handle this person who is making a request. What are they specifically asking for? What are the impacts on daily living that this person is facing or working through? So all of that is fair game, and all of that is something that we should be looking at when you're an employer and you're dealing with employees with long COVID. If you want to talk more about whether or not your employee has long COVID, you probably want to talk to a doctor. If you need some help with the legal side of things, please don't hesitate to give us a call. In the meantime, we'll talk to you later. Go out and watch some live soccer. Bye-bye.